The military regimes in Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger have announced on Sunday their immediate withdrawal from the West African bloc, ECOWAS. The leaders of the three Sahel nations issued a statement saying it was a sovereign decision to leave the Economic Community of West African States without delay. Struggling with jihadist violence and poverty, the regimes have had tense ties with ECOWAS since coups took place in Niger last July, Burkina Faso in 2022, and Mali in 2020. All three were suspended from ECOWAS, with Niger and Mali facing heavy sanctions. They have hardened their positions in recent months and joined forces in an alliance of Sahel States.
Excellence le capitaine Ibrahim Traoré, le colonel Assimi Goïta et le général de brigade Abdourahmane Tchani, respectivement chef d'État du Burkina Faso, de la République du Mali et de la République du Niger, prenant toutes leurs responsabilités devant l'histoire et répondant aux attentes, préoccupations et aspirations de leur population, décident en toute souveraineté du retrait sans délai du Burkina Faso, du Mali et du Niger de la communauté économique des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, fait à Ouagadougou, à Bamako et à Niamey le 28 janvier 2024.
Joining me on the news is Dr. Oluwole Ojewale, Regional Coordinator, Central Africa at the Institute for Security Studies. Dr. Joali, thank you so much for joining us on the news.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger accused ECOWAS of inhumane sanctions to reverse the coups in their nation as reasons for withdrawal. Does this daring move by the West African countries have a justification, and will there be consequences?
Well, I think like a military balance, what they call mutually assured destruction, that is MAD, is going to be the possible end in view unless there is a quick response to find a win-win approach to this particular challenge that we're having now. Because there is a due process that is laid according to Article 91 of ECOWAS for any member state to exit the Union. And it says any member state wishing to withdraw from the community shall give to the executive secretary 1 year's notice in writing, who shall inform the member state thereof. I don't think based on the recent development, there has been that fulfillment of that requirement according to the ECOWAS protocol and statute that established the organization. So the implication of this is that if this is allowed to stay, you can see a complete fracturing of ECOWAS. And when you look at the global challenges of terrorism and other forces that we are contending with, we are only better together as a unity that is stronger and working together in terms of cooperation and collaboration. So the implication for these are going to be felt in terms of security response to counter terrorism in the region, which is already spilling over into the Torah state of Ghana, Benin, Togo, and then the other nations around that corridor. So I think the broader view of the consequences can be felt by all, not just those three states alone.
Let's now look at ECOWAS activities based on binding rules. Now, these three countries alleged that ECOWAS has moved away from the ideals of Pan-Africanism after nearly 50 years of establishment. So, looking at how the regional body has reacted and handled the military coups in these countries that seem to be largely supported by their people, do you think that ECOWAS is culpable, or it acted based on stipulated laws and accords?
Well, I think ECOWAS has our own shortfalls, particularly when this thing started unraveling in Mali in 2020. The lopsided approach to it, the lackluster approach to it, and then some head of state in the region who also tried to elongate their stay in power don't help matter. So the way ECOWAS has responded over the past 3 years has suddenly in the case of the situation in Niger, in which it appears ECOWAS has suddenly woken up and is trying to find a solution to a problem that has been lingering for 4 years. Those are the areas in which I think ECOWAS has not demonstrated good faith in addressing this democratic erosion in the region. But it is not to the military junta to say ECOWAS has not lived up to reality in the last 49 or 50 years, because they themselves are unconstitutional government. So it is not with them to now ascertain whether ECOWAS has actually lived up to the responsibility. It is left for the citizens to determine that. I think what is playing out in those three states now is that they want to force the hand of ECOWAS to the negotiation table and to be able to negotiate at the point of strength. Don't forget that in case of Mali, for instance, the transitional constitution in that country has provided some form of amnesty to the regime to also have their people on the ballot. So I think they want to have a mutual negotiation so that whatever ECOWAS permits in one country is going to be generalized for all. That is the final objective that I think they are trying to do with this new development.
Well, of course, you might say that these military junta or regimes are illegitimate. And of course, you describe them as an unconstitutional government. But then when you look at what has happened in these three countries, you discover that the people in these countries have thrown their mighty weight behind these military leaders after the coups that went down in this country. So don't you think that in a way it legitimizes their rights to remove democratic powers that you have also described as wanting to always perpetuate themselves in power and try to bring about stability in the country when you look at the political situation, the terrorism that has decimated these countries, and the need for socioeconomic growth that has eluded these countries?
It's a case of two wrongs don't make a right here. No matter how we flip it aside, we are not going to come to the point that we begin to glorify the procured legitimacy that the military juntas have procured in those countries. You see people who are jumping out, rejoicing when they take over power in those countries. The honeymoon doesn't last beyond 48 hours. You've never seen them on the street again. As a matter of fact, they might, whatever they are doing, it is civil liberties that actually separate democracy from an authoritarian regime. And what you see in those countries is that people are losing their voices on a daily basis. In Mali, in Burkina Faso, the freedom of right, the freedom of association, the freedom of free expression, those things have been taken away from the people. For instance, in places where military government have ruled over the years, they built roads, they built hospitals. Democracy is also affording people those priority. But what you don't find is that civil liberty is not guaranteed. And that is not, I mean, that is what differentiates these regimes from the democratic regime. So we can't say people have actually conferred legitimacy on them because they took away their democratically elected government and imposed themselves through the barriers of the gun. So two wrongs can't make a right. And in those countries that you mentioned, based on available data, I'm going to cite Afrobarometer, citizen support for democracy is way above 50%. And at the same time, the reasons why they came into power is that they said there's corruption, there's insecurity. But according to Armed Conflict Event Location Database, in the past 2 to 3 years, the attacks have been on the rise. So these people are just preoccupied with regime protection without finding solutions to the problem that they claimed that they were going to address when they came into power.
So how do you expect ECOWAS to respond to this? Because if they do not, as you have said, of course, these countries are trying to force ECOWAS to the table to dialogue. But then if ECOWAS remains to be obstinate to these particular demand, what do you think will be the fallout for Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso? So how do you expect ECOWAS to respond to this?
We're living in a time of globalization in which event-shaping development globally requires that nations should work together in a cooperative sense. So I expect ECOWAS to now begin to tread really softly. Enough of those violent rhetorics of a military invasion, which is already in the backside of the conversation now. So I expect that ECOWAS should rejig its diplomatic engagement with these countries and find a win-win approach. And the countries that are also under these defense pacts, these three countries that are also opting out of ECOWAS, don't forget that they are about some of the most poorest countries in the region. One, these are landlocked states. None of them have access to the sea. It's like a case of we need one another. For them to be able to effectively prosecute counter-terrorism operation in that region, they need the cooperation of ECOWAS countries. For them to be able to trade effectively, they also need the cooperation of these other ECOWAS countries. And then the sanctions that have been placed on those countries, ECOWAS must find the means to relax those sanctions now and expedite the transition, the conversation forward so that they can probably realize that within the next 18 to 24 months. I think the bone of contention here that we cannot also shy away from is that I think those regimes actually want to perpetuate themselves in power. And that is something that ECOWAS is probably going to kick against. But both parties must find a midpoint where it's going to be a win-win approach for on both ends of the divides.
Dr. Oluwole Ojewale, thank you so much for helping us to understand this better. We appreciate your presence and contribution.
Thank you so much for having me.